Title showdowns are a lot of fun. They're even more fun when you've got more than 2 people in with a realistic chance of taking the championship going into a final Grand Prix. But it doesn't happen very often, but that's just the way that Formula 1 is. In my lifetime, I think it's happened just twice. The first being in 2007, when it was that fight between Raikkonen, who won the championship that year, and 2 of his 3 teammates, Hamilton and Alonso. That last part is probably going to confuse some and elicit a hearty chuckle from others who know what I'm talking about. Those 3 drivers were way ahead of everybody else going into that final Grand Prix. But in 2010, it happened again. This time there were 4 drivers who could have won the championship, and it ended up being won by the guy that we weren't expecting to actually win the championship because everybody was hyper-fixated on another team and driver. And this is exactly what happened at the 2010 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. It was a season where 5 drivers from 3 teams won races: Alonso, Hamilton, Vettel, Webber and Button. Jensen had moved to McLaren after his underdog championship victory the previous year with Brawn, and Brawn in turn had now become the Mercedes team, with Mercedes releasing both Button and Barrichello and replacing them with 2 Germans, Rosberg and some bloke called Schumacher. It was also a season of 3 new teams. HRT, Virgin and Lotus joined the grid and filled things out to be 24 cars, with those 3 fighting for the final scraps of Constructors' Championship payouts, as only the top 10 would get some money off Bernie. Those 3 teams I've covered in their own videos, lured in with the promises of cost caps that never came, and none of those 3 teams would survive to see the 2017 Big Boy regulations. It was also the last season for Bridgestone. They'd been in Formula 1 since 1997 and were now bowing out, just like BMW, Toyota and Honda had done. Basically, it was all the carryover from the economic recession that basically ruined a lot of people and put a lot of people in precarious situations business-wise and just financially, the normal person as well. So Bridgestone decided this isn't worth us spending a lot of money on, and they bowed out, and Pirelli would come in for the 2011 season. And Pirelli's still there. But at the end of the previous season, it was clear that Red Bull was onto something. Given Brawn's big advantage with the double diffuser in the early part of the 2009 season, they were able to get a massive lead before the other teams started to catch up. Red Bull got a hang of the newer regulations and they'd gone from being a mid-grid team to a front-grid team, and Sebastian Vettel got Red Bull's first win at the Chinese Grand Prix. Webber would get his first win at Hockenheim. And while McLaren had endured a tough start to the 2009 season, they clawed it back a bit with Hamilton getting a win at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and another at Singapore. But really, the championship fight towards the end was between Button and Vettel, with Vettel finishing just 11 points behind Button come the end, and Red Bull won the last 3 rounds of the season in Japan, Brazil and Abu Dhabi. Meanwhile, Alonso had left Renault and joined Ferrari. At the same time, Alonso became the 7th driver to win on his Ferrari debut, along with Raikkonen, Fangio, Musso, Baghetti, Andretti and Mansell. And on top of this, the Tifosi was beginning to wonder that after the heartache of 2008, Ferrari was going to have a new world champion just 3 years after the previous one. The thing about the 2010 season as well is that it wasn't short of drama. Several parts, if not all of the parts, being covered on this channel by now. There's the proposed breakaway series, F-ducts, blown diffusers, the 3 new teams and their issues, the front wing debacle at Silverstone, Alonso being livid with Hamilton for the whole safety car thing at Valencia, Fernando is faster than you, and that's all of it, isn't it? Actually no, I still need to do the Vettel and Webber crash at Turkey that same year, but once I've done that video, I think the 2010 season has been fully covered. And it was a long slog of a season. Unlike in 2009, there was no obvious dominant car or driver, as every driver in the top 3 teams, with the exception of Massa, won a race. In fact, all 5 of them won more than 1 Grand Prix, Vettel having 4 before the final round, Alonso 5, Webber on 4, Hamilton on 3, and Button on 2. But in addition, the championship flipped and flopped, as for every good result one of the drivers had, they'd have 1 or 2 in response that allowed the other drivers to take some points off them. And also for 2010, this was the first season where it was the top 10 scoring points rather than the top 8, so it's now 25 for the winner rather than 10. All of this going on meant that going into the final round at Abu Dhabi, 4 drivers had a shot of taking all the glory. Alonso led the standings on 246 points, with Webber in second on 238. Vettel was 7 points behind Webber on 231, with Hamilton on 222. Championship permutations were as follows. Alonso, in theory, had the easiest set of criteria to meet. He didn't need to win the race. He could still come second behind Webber and take it, but if Alonso was 3rd, 4th or 5th, Webber had to win the race. If Alonso was 6th, Webber needed 2nd. If Alonso was 7th or 8th, Webber needed 3rd. If Alonso no scored, Webber just needed 5th. Vettel could win the title if he won the race and Alonso was 5th or lower. If Vettel was 2nd and Alonso lower than 10th, Vettel would win the title. There's also a mad stat out there that somebody has taken the time to calculate, but we'll get to that towards the end of the video. Hamilton, of the four, was the one with the biggest outside chance. He had to win the race and hope that Alonso didn't score a point, that Webber was 6th or worse, and Vettel was 3rd or worse. Button, meanwhile, he was out of it ages ago. He's just there for reference. The bookies, though, were divided on who the favourite was. Alonso was favourite with 8 to 11 odds with Ladbrokes, while Webber was favourite with another outlet. Stan James, meanwhile, had Vettel as the favourite. But Webber wasn't too optimistic about his chances. After the Brazilian Grand Prix, he'd spoken out against his team, suggesting that Vettel was getting more help and a bigger push to win the championship, despite Webber being ahead and closer to Alonso. When he was asked about this, he simply replied, "Well, it's fucking obvious, isn't it?" There's no bleep there because I'm quoting. There are also mutterings in the motorsport world that Red Bull might try and do some sort of team order stuff if they were in a position to do so. Team orders had already caused a bit of uproar at the German Grand Prix when Massa was given the "Fernando is faster than you" message that allowed Nando to pass Felipe and go on to win the race. Dietrich Mateschitz said to the media that they weren't going to do it, although Vettel said that he would help Mark out if he had to. I'm guessing that Vettel wasn't anticipating that he would win the title given his position and how close Webber was to Alonso. But as a wise man once said, anything can happen in Formula 1, and it usually does. Vettel took pole position for the race with a time of 1:39.394. Hamilton was in 2nd and Alonso 3rd, which was already a good thing for the Ferrari driver because he was ahead of Webber, who was back in 5th, and Jensen was in between them. So maybe Fernando could get some assistance off Jensen as Button held up Webber to help Lewis. But at the same time, Jensen could get past Alonso and then help Lewis that way by holding Alonso up. But for Alonso to be where he was, it was very impressive. It was his first year at Ferrari and it had taken until around the German Grand Prix to be consistently on the podium. 3 wins in the late season, including a win at Korea where both Red Bulls retired, really helped him out. But he had a couple of setbacks during that season. At the already mentioned European Grand Prix, he'd accused Hamilton of cheating and deliberately hesitating to pass the safety car that ruined his track position, and he'd also been hit by his own teammate at Silverstone where he'd finished 14th and out of the points. Between his win at Bahrain and his next win in Germany, he'd only been on the podium twice. His average finishing position in those opening 10 races was 6th. Well, 6th.3. At the start, Vettel got away cleanly and led everybody into turn 1. He was followed by Hamilton and Button, who had managed to get ahead of a slow-starting Alonso. But crucially, Alonso was ahead of Webber, outscoring him. All he had to do was keep the Red Bull behind him. At the chicane at the end of the first sector, Rosberg tagged the Michael and spun him round. As the rest of the field took avoiding action, Liuzzi crashed head-on into the Mercedes and vaulted up into the engine cover. He was lucky to not take Schumacher's head off. Safety car deployed, which would allow Alonso a crack at Button on the restart. During the safety car period, Petrov, Senna, Rosberg and a few others decided they were going to get rid of their tyres and go onto the harder compound. Rules were that they had to use both the Bridgestone tyres that had been brought to the Grand Prix, which in this case were the Super Softs and the Softs. So the Softs were the hards and the Super Softs were the softs, if that makes any sense. And the Super Softs were easily identifiable by this mint green band that went around the sidewall. One thing helping Alonso out during this race was that Webber was experiencing some hefty degradation on his rear tyres, and Webber came into the pits on lap 11 to get rid of them. Massa was in 6th behind Webber, so if Ferrari could get Massa ahead with an overcut, they could use him as a rolling roadblock and help Alonso out a bit more. Webber being 2 positions behind was better than just the 1. But it didn't work. Massa joined back onto the track behind Webber. That wasn't part of L plan. So at the end of lap 15, Alonso came in to get his tyres changed in an attempt at covering Webber, which surprised everybody. What's also interesting to note here is that Alonso and Webber had started on the option tyre and switched to the hards. But out in front, both Hamilton and Vettel were setting faster times on knackered super softs that Alonso and Webber were doing on the fresh, harder compound. But what had also happened was something that pretty much decided the outcome of the race, and therefore the championship. While Alonso had rejoined in front of Webber, both cars were behind Vitaly Petrov's Renault down in 12th. As other cars came in for their stops, the 3 cars climbed up the order, but for Alonso and Webber and their championship aspirations, it wasn't a climb that was going fast enough. Alonso attempted to overtake Petrov on lap 23 into the first of the 2 chicanes on that mammoth backstretch, but Alonso had to back out because he'd locked the rears and almost wiped both of the cars out. That same lap, Hamilton pitted. He then overtook Kobayashi and got stuck behind Kubica. He tried to chase the pole in the other Renault down and get back into 2nd place and keep some championship hopes alive, because if Vettel retired, Hamilton getting into the lead would have given him the championship. What's key to note here is that Hamilton was stuck behind one Renault on old tyres, while Alonso was stuck behind the other one on old tyres. So it's safe to assume that the Renaults of Petrov and Kubica had got some sort of straight line advantage, and the speed traps were showing that the Renault of Petrov was the third quickest in the speed trap in qualifying, being around 3 km an hour faster than Alonso's Ferrari. Both Renaults had brand new engines for this race, which was definitely helping them because they had all the horsepower available to them. Hamilton, while trying to get past Kubica and just trying to lob his car into every gap imaginable to try and get by and then chase after Vettel, was wiping out all of the cameras that had been placed in these little bollards on the apexes of some of the corners. Afterwards he went, well, they're insured, aren't they? But what also interfered with L's plan is that even though Hamilton was losing time trying to get past Kubica, Kubica then managed to get back into the swing of things, and even on tyres that were approaching 40 laps old, was still lapping around 6/10 faster than Alonso per lap. So when Kubica finally pitted and released Hamilton, he would also rejoin in front of Alonso. Kubica, Kobayashi and Button were going as long as possible, so when the three of them pitted, it gave Vettel the lead back, and the problems that Hamilton had getting past Kubica allowed Vettel a decent gap to just manage things until the end. Hamilton closed the gap to around 10 seconds come the end of the race, but Vettel crossed the line to be the winner of the race and the championship. The TV shots, once they cut away from the celebrating Red Bull crews, showed Alonso giving it all this to Petrov as if it was Petrov's fault that Alonso had lost the championship. Martin Brundle, who was commentating for the BBC at the time, just said, "Get real, son." I miss Sassy Brundle. Where's this Sassy Brundle on Sky Sports where he's just corporate Brundle? I mean, he still does have his moments, but nowhere near like "Get real, son" or "You hit the wrong part of him, my friend," that sort of stuff. Petrov had kept Alonso at bay for 40 laps. As one person put it online at the time, in response to someone saying Hamilton's car was faster in a straight line than Kubica's, so... The thing is, you can expect Kubica to take it to Hamilton. The guy probably could have gone pretty far if not for the rally crash. Meanwhile, Petrov versus Alonso should have been a no-brainer. And for 40 laps on older tyres as well. You'd think there'd be a point where Alonso and his car could have been able to get by at some point. It's probably part of the reason that DRS came in for the following year, isn't it? So what went wrong for Ferrari then? Part of the reason they brought Massa in was they'd seen that Webber had come out of the pits and been stuck behind Al Ghashwari's Toro Rosso, and decided that pitting Massa to get in front would be a good idea. The problem was Massa lost 1.4 seconds in the pit stop, and Webber cleared Jaime the same lap that Massa came in, so the whole thing was for nothing. Ferrari was also thinking that Webber was doing the same thing he'd done at Singapore, where he'd pitted early and then picked everybody off as the tyres dropped off. They were also confident that Alonso's ability and car would then be able to pick off Petrov and Rosberg, but both the Mercedes and Renault had some sort of straight line advantage that the Ferrari didn't, so the gamble just didn't work. There's also the fact that, to the surprise of a lot of people, the super soft tyre that was the option tyre for the race came back to Hamilton and Vettel, and they were able to go a bit longer. As mentioned, both those drivers were going faster than Alonso on much older rubber that was way past its best. Racefans.net wrote in the immediate aftermath of the race that between laps 8 and 13, Vettel's lap times had dropped from 145.337 to 146.667, so 1.3 seconds lost in 5 laps. Ferrari saw this as massive drop-off and then used that data to pit Alonso, only for Lewis and Seb and others who were still out there to have their tyres come back to them on that very same lap that Alonso pitted. So was it a bad gamble or just bad luck? I'll leave it to you to decide. Some people online have been suggesting that Ferrari focused on the wrong Red Bull during this race, and somebody else said that it was a bad strategy call by Ferrari of all people. Hi, I'm from the future. You haven't seen anything yet. Vettel winning the title made him the youngest Formula 1 champion in history, beating Hamilton's record by about 160 days. Vettel was left speechless by what he had achieved, and it was a win that had seemingly come out of nowhere, because virtually everybody else was watching Alonso and Webber and expected Alonso to always be in the right position, but it wasn't to be this time. Hamilton meanwhile said that next year would be a better year, so practicing for being a Ferrari driver even back then. So time for that mad stat that I told you about before. If Alonso had managed to get up to 5th and finish behind Rosberg, then the championship would have finished in absolutely mental circumstances. Vettel and Alonso would have been tied on points. They'd be tied on wins, second places, and third places too. Vettel would have still won the championship because he had more 4th places than Alonso, 4 versus 2. But here's the main statistic to take away from this particular season. The championship lead changed 10 times over the course of the championship, the most amount of changes in history, a record shared with 1984. Button was knocked out of contention after the Brazilian Grand Prix, but I've left him in here because he led at 1 point. Or 2. Or 3. But either way, it shows the progression, with Vettel coming out of nowhere to take the title and be one of only 3 drivers to lead the championship the day they won it. That record is shared with James Hunt and John Surtees. And so began the Sebastian Vettel era. So then, a look at the ending of the 2010 Formula 1 season. If this has been something that's taught you some bits and bobs from years gone by, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on any future stuff I do. Massive thanks as ever to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon, and if you want to help contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank and support at a more personal level, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliate links and other bits and pieces. Other super thanks for the one and done donations, and there's memberships to spam Randy Feltface and Roberto Moreno emojis in comments. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.